Welcome to Module 4, Well-Being and Resilience. In the last module, we learned how traumatic experiences affect development generally and adults with IDD specifically. This module will help you understand the role of protective factors, such as a secure attachment and a healing and protective environment, in enhancing well-being and resilience, and how to provide practical tools and support for people with IDD and their caregivers. After completing Module 4, you should be able to do the following. Explore the impact on caregivers of learning about the traumatic experience. Explain strategies for strengthening protective factors to enhance well-being, resilience, and recovery. Describe frameworks for promoting a healing and protective environment in order to create a safe and meaningful life for adults with IDD. And implement person-centered planning techniques to help adults with IDD realize their hopes and dreams. As was true in our previous modules, the topics we're going to cover may be upsetting. They may bring up difficult memories of clients that you've helped. It may evoke feelings of unfairness and injustice, and enhances our desire to protect. The material in this training may bring up feelings and thoughts related to your experiences. Please feel free to pause, step out of the room, and come back at any time. Alternatively, it is okay to continue even if you are feeling emotional. We strongly encourage you to take care of yourself not only during this training, but also in your work setting. We will talk more about the importance of self-care in Module 6. Remember our brick wall from Module 1? Let's take a closer look at the actual bricks. A key question is, how do we increase and enhance protective factors? How do we get these bricks strong? To do this, you have to know what can help strengthen them. To add to our metaphor, the question becomes, how do we add mortar to build, rebuild, and strengthen the bricks? Let's look at 4 specific areas where we can strengthen protective factors: individual, family, community, and culture. What are some ideas that you have for increasing and enhancing protective factors in each of these 4 areas? For example, one way to increase community protective factors is by educating the community about trauma and the value of including people with IDD in services, support, and treatment. This discussion should remind you of the ecological framework that we introduced in Module 1. Essentially, we are highlighting protective factors in each of these circles. These are examples of actions that are the mortar to help strengthen protective factors. Ask and answer the person's or caregiver's questions. Provide timely information. Promote person-centered planning, a healing and protective environment, and a secure attachment. Address traumatic experiences of caregivers, providers, and friends. Partner with caregivers to create a recovery team. Help the person and caregivers access IDD and trauma-informed support and services. And help caregivers navigate systems of care, including systems challenges. Protective factors can offset many challenges. As providers, your job is to help strengthen protective factors with specific strategies, such as those listed on this slide. We can think of the mortar as what strengthens protective factors. For example, building strong social connections, promoting person-centered planning, helping the person navigate systems of care, etc. All of these action-oriented verbs, the doing, helps strengthen the protective factors. First, we'll review some ways to respond in the aftermath of trauma. In the next 2 modules, we'll discuss ways that providers can respond to an adult with IDD who has experienced trauma in a sensitive way, and how we can resist using policies and practices that might re-traumatize them, and ideally help them recover and thrive. The first place to start is to ask and answer questions. People with IDD have concerns and questions after a traumatic experience. A provider can start by asking questions. As we discussed in Modules 2 and 3, there is a lot to be found out about the IDD and the traumatic experiences. Some people may feel reluctant to ask about trauma for fear of making things worse, or stirring up emotions that they think the person can't handle. Research has actually shown that people with IDD appreciate being asked about trauma. They feel like someone cares. When we don't ask about the trauma or how it has impacted the person, we may send the message that we don't care or that we can't handle it. Additionally, providers need information about how the caregiving system is doing. What is the family environment like, and what was it like for them growing up? What is their current support system like? What are the dynamics? How much support does the person have? And what questions do the family and/or caregivers have? Recognize that caregivers' questions may center around what's to come. A key role for the provider is to provide anticipatory guidance, especially related to how distress may be diminished and how traumatic experiences may affect the person over time. Ask more questions to figure out where you can be helpful. What are the primary concerns right now, whether or not they seem relevant to you as the interviewer? Some common questions or concerns might be how to assure safety in the setting in which the trauma occurred. Is the person still in the setting where the traumatic experience occurred? Does adult protective services need to be involved? Does the person need to be in out-of-home care? How to protect the adult and still assure as much independence as possible. Will the person ever feel whole and secure again? How can caregivers help the adult attain a valued and meaningful life despite the traumatic experience? How to obtain respite or home services? How to maintain developmental progress? Are there other questions that you may have for the person with IDD or their caregivers? Efforts to provide early intervention for people with IDD should encompass broad, holistic approaches to support and should complement efforts to provide timely information about trauma. Psychological first aid is a strategy developed by the National Center for PTSD and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It emphasizes providing support and safety and helping connect trauma survivors with appropriate resources. Psychological first aid is different from psychological debriefing, which has been shown to interfere with recovery. Unlike psychological debriefing, psychological first aid does not assume that trauma survivors are doomed to develop PTSD and doesn't force survivors to talk about or process the trauma. Instead, psychological first aid focuses on using compassionate and supportive strategies to establish a sense of safety and stabilization, gather information on the immediate needs of the person, such as food, water, shelter, safety, providing practical assistance in meeting those needs, helping to connect the person or family with social supports, providing information on coping strategies to reduce stress, and linkage with collaborative services for more sustained monitoring and service delivery. It may be helpful to supplement with in-home modeling and mentoring. This may sometimes provide more concentrated help than a treatment hour with a clinician. However, accessing these types of services may take additional coordination and support from the clinician and the person's caregiving system. For people with IDD who have experienced trauma, it is most important for providers and caregivers to create or recreate an interpersonal environment that is sufficiently healing to counteract the trauma. Following a traumatic experience, creating and maintaining consistent routines provides reassurance. So return to normal routines as much as possible, providing additional support and reassurance if the person has new or worsened fears, and limit exposure to media or other traumatic material. People with IDD need providers and caregivers to use micro-behaviors of relationships, attuned to their needs. These are common everyday social interactions like facial expressions, physical touch, nonverbal vocalizations like sighs and ums, physical postures, positioning, and proximity. So what does it mean to be attuned? First, recognize a person's emotional state in the moment. Then, imagine it from the person's perspective. Acknowledge it and reflect it through facial expressions and words, such as, "You might be sad, I would be too." Providing gentle comfort and saying things like, "It will change. Together we'll get through it. It will get better." Remember that all behavior is communication, and recognize that a given behavior may be the person's method for adapting to unwanted circumstances. Disentangling and understanding behavior and yet managing it can be challenging and overwhelming, particularly if the adult with IDD is engaging in trauma-related behaviors that others find challenging. This requires providers and caregivers to imagine a person's experience of trauma and recognize that they are coping as best they can. Person-centered tools and interventions can be used to look at creating an environment that makes the behavior expression less challenging to understand and address. For people with IDD functioning at an earlier developmental level, relationship-based approaches are most effective. There are frameworks such as gentle teaching, positive behavior support, and positive identity development for thinking about challenging behavior that expands behavior management, which can focus solely on control and compliance, to include a focus on increasing quality of life, changing the environment, increasing alternative means of communication, and sometimes using alternate supports such as pictures. The tools of gentle teaching, positive behavior supports, and positive identity development can be readily learned and used by caregivers and providers to promote and recreate that secure base. We will briefly discuss the principles of gentle teaching, positive behavior supports, and positive identity development later in this module. How do we build a wall of protective factors around adults with IDD who have experienced trauma? Enhancing the family's well-being and resilience is an essential part of enhancing the person's well-being, resilience, and recovery. Families and other caregivers are a critical part of both protecting people from harm and enhancing their natural resilience. However, caregivers may find it difficult to be protective if they have been affected by trauma, and they may need help and support in order to draw on their own natural strengths. Additionally, institutions in which caregivers are the source of the trauma, they will need more intensive interventions, in addition to education and support, especially if they have trauma histories of their own. Providing trauma-informed education and services to parents and other caregivers enhances their protective capacities, thereby increasing the resilience, safety, permanency, and well-being of the person with IDD. Providers should recognize that caregivers themselves may have trauma histories or experience secondary traumatic stress, and provide them with appropriate trauma-focused support and intervention. It's important to keep in mind that safety and protection are chronic worries among caregivers in regard to the person they support. So is the promise of the fullest, most valued life they can achieve. Both of these concerns and hopes are heightened in the parents of a person with IDD. Caregivers of people with IDD want to find and provide the best care for the person they love and support, to sustain and maximize their maturity and independence across development and changing circumstances, and to help them function at his or her best and attain a meaningful life. Providing care for another person, whether an adult child, family member, or client, can strain a relationship even without IDD or trauma. Caregivers may feel inadequate because they don't know what to do. With IDD and trauma, caregivers may vary in terms of their acceptance or feelings of grief and loss related to the IDD and trauma and the way they respond. They may not fully understand the functioning level of the person or may have expectations of recovery or progression that may not be realistic. These differences in response can cause stress and strain in relationships and create conflicts. The essential act of listening to the traumatic experience of others and dealing with the aftermath of traumatic experiences, including their behavior, thinking, and emotional responses, may take an emotional toll that can compromise caregivers' functioning and interfere with limit setting, routines, and result in overprotection. Caregivers might also relax routines and limits because they feel the person has suffered enough, which can end up being more unsettling for the person with IDD. Providers should recognize the potential impact of traumatic experiences of people with IDD on their caregivers. Caregivers may have anticipatory anxiety about safety, protection, how to ensure that the person they care for will be happy and healthy, etc. They may also experience secondary traumatic stress due to hearing about the traumatic experiences, their role in failing to protect, and/or because it is a reminder of their own trauma history. For example, it is not unlikely that for many, the traumatic experiences involved both the person and the caregiver, and so they might serve as traumatic reminders for each other. Intervention requires the reparation of the relationship, as this will be the vehicle for recovery. Families of adults with IDD may have increased stress due to ongoing needs of the person that has stretched into adulthood. Providers can support caregivers by acknowledging sources of stress and concern, such as financial stress, providing anticipatory guidance, and answering questions. Review the ways in which a caregiver's personal history of trauma can impact his or her behavior. Caregivers' own avoidance of trauma reminders can prevent them from seeing red flags regarding the person's safety, or can contribute to minimizing or denying the person's abuse experiences, or maximizing or exaggerating their experiences. A parent or caregiver with his or her own trauma history may have experienced firsthand how difficult and painful it is to talk about the trauma, and may therefore want to shield the person they support from a similar experience. Caregivers of someone with IDD who has experienced trauma often have secondary traumatic stress reactions. Past and recurrent traumatic experiences can impact caregivers' ability to keep the person safe and to work effectively with providers. Coordinating caregivers' care, such as mental health needs or trauma treatment, with the person's care, such as medical and trauma treatment, can pose challenges. When the parent is the source of the traumatic experience, it adds a layer to the dynamics of the relationship, as well as how treatment needs to occur. Safety of the person with IDD in the relationship must be addressed first. Interventions will vary depending on whether the person is with the parent or out of the home, which often depends on the nature of the trauma. In such cases, specialized therapeutic interventions are typically warranted with the person, parent, and possibly the dyad, depending on the situation and plan for the family. Research on optimal child development shows that parenting that is protective, nurturing, attuned, and responsive serves as a secure base and supports resiliency through adulthood. Adults with IDD may still rely heavily on caregivers to provide a secure base. This may be even more important if they have experienced disruption in their caregiving relationships because of loss or trauma. A number of characteristics associated with developmental delays and disabilities may impact caregiver responsiveness alone or in combination with other factors. For example, unusual repetitive behaviors, poor eye contact, aggressive outbursts, unintelligible speech, or difficulty following directions may be sufficient to affect caregivers' efforts to be responsive. Similarly, caregiver characteristics unrelated to the person's disability may affect caregivers' responsiveness. If the caregiver is depressed, for example, responsiveness and resilience of the caregiver can be compromised, at least temporarily. Traumatic experiences can affect caregiver responsiveness because they can create more questions and hopelessness or helplessness in the face of a multitude of emotions, such as stress, loss, grief, or anger. It is important for the caregiver's response to the person to be contingent and sensitive. For example, accurate readings of the person's cues and needs, and empathic and supportive responses. A caregiver who is very engaged but misreading the person's cues, such as being overly intrusive, can also be problematic. Adults with IDD also need to have secure relationships with peers, with and without disabilities, in the community. Trauma may negatively impact their ability to judge between healthy and unhealthy relationships, and this may be an area in which they need additional support and skill building. As providers, our task is to provide or help caregivers provide a secure base, secure attachment, as a protective factor, or to recreate a secure base when it has been damaged by trauma, and to help the person with IDD develop meaningful and healthy relationships in their community. Help people access IDD and trauma-informed supports. This can include informal supports, such as community and church groups, extended family, friends, and other families with people with IDD. Formal supports include organizations that provide disability services, waiver supports, supplemental security income, in-home supportive services. Providers can help the person with IDD and caregivers access support by being an advocate for them. Peer-to-peer supports include organizations that connect families together or connect self-advocates to other self-advocates, and sibling supports. It is important to note that not all IDD supports may be trauma-informed. Asking questions to assess how trauma-informed organizations are is the first step in helping organizations to become more trauma-informed. Increasing the demand for trauma-informed organizations often leads to an increase in knowledge and skill building among staff.